Thanks for joining me again. This week we're going to begin talking about the role that technology plays in society in our daily lives. It's going to be a big topic. We're certainly not going to be able to do a deep dive on this, but this is a good place to start as far as understanding the way that technology influences us and the type of behaviors that we exhibit with technology, and then thus the kind of forensic artifacts we can identify with technology. Essentially, before we can identify from a first of all, from a criminological aspect, how does technology play into the commission of crime, the evidence that's left behind. But essentially, without understanding how technology fits with human beings in the 21st century, you can't really tell at what points the human being and technology will intersect. And as we learned last week with Locard's exchange principle, every contact leaves a trace. So we need to identify points in technology use where there will be such contact and then thus a trace. So let's get started. So first, what you're seeing here are some advertisements from a bygone era. You will note that we have some advertisements that you might consider silly, right? Because looking back, we know that they don't do what they purport to do. For example, up here in the upper left-hand corner, we've got the electropathic belt, thought to be useful for treating a number of maladies, but especially weight loss. We have Bonner's electromagnetic bathing fluid, which purports to cure rheumatism, cholera, epilepsy, among many others. We have Electricity in a Bottle, West's Electric Cure, which claims to cure hay fever, asthma, colds, etc., etc. And Nature's Chief Restorer, Electricity, Pulvermacher's Electric Belts. Pulvermacher must be a German name, meaning one who makes pulvers. We look at this now, we know, of course, electricity can't be used to cure colds, can't be used to cure asthma. Of course, it's not going to help you lose weight. Of course, it's not going to cure epilepsy or scarlet fever or necrosis, whatever any of those things happen to be. And of course, it's not Nature's Chief Restorer. We know in our era that electricity can be quite destructive, but it can also be quite useful, but certainly not for any of these things. But our knowledge of electricity is, we look back at these advertisements with the benefit of hindsight, and hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. We can look back, and we know this, but there was a time in our society where electricity was a new thing, and nobody was really quite sure what it was capable of. All the public knew was what disseminated to them through various information disseminating mechanisms in our society at the time. And those mechanisms seemed to send simultaneous messages that this was a dangerous new technology, that it would make people lazy, that it could be used to kill people, but also at the same time that it could work miracles, heretofore untold wonders, like creating light without flame, causing things to move under their own power, transmitting through the air, right? So this is a new technology that had previously been unharnessed, but the only prior contact that human beings had with electricity was lightning, which is a phenomenon that inspires both awe and fear. I suppose awe in every sense. But now we know better. But at the time, they didn't. And of course, these advertisements are capitalizing upon that newness, right? And they aren't the only ones. These happen to be cures from our patent medicine days that purport to use electricity in some fashion. But the electromagnetic bathing fluid that we see here in the lower left-hand corner, or the electropathic belt, it was not uncommon in this time for other products to capitalize on this new electricity technology and to apply the prefix electro to their product. It happened all the time, and a few of those products even survive today. Electrolux vacuum cleaners, for example, are still around today and are an example of products that were around in this era that capitalized on the newness of electricity at the time. That's not all that different from what we have today, right? Today, the prefix cyber is being applied before many things, and it is the new technology that is awe-inspiring in every sense. It is we are told that it is simultaneously the most dangerous thing out there, that it's destroying society, that it's also capable of wonders and miracles heretofore unimaginable, right? What is cyber? Well, that's as difficult to define now as defining electro was back then. But back then, of course, electro having something to do with electricity. Well, these days, cyber having something to do with the internet. So we've got cyber security, cyber warfare, cyberspace, cyber attack, cyber harassment, cyber chats. All of these things that are designated to be something cyber, which indicates to us only that it takes place online somehow in some fashion. Well, just as the prefix electro became passé as electricity began to be adopted by more and more of society, it began to be disused because it was no longer beneficial in a marketing sense to include it, right? Something being electro began to lose meaning because, of course, everything became electro, right? There wasn't anything that wasn't running off of electricity. And, of course, we begin to take these miracles for granted. After a while, the miracle of flipping a switch and the room being flooded with light became commonplace. So we began to take it for granted. Well, we're definitely at a point where the prefix cyber is becoming passé as well. There's no such thing anymore as cyber security. There's just security, because what happens over the internet or what happens online or what happens within these virtual environments has a direct impact on the real world. There's no cyber warfare when anything that happens to our technical infrastructure in terms of critical infrastructure in the U.S. or our military infrastructure, when it affects the average troop in real life, when it affects their ability to maintain supply lines, intelligence, deployments. It's no longer cyber warfare, that's just warfare. So it's becoming passé, right? Attack in cyberspace is an attack on a very real institution. Or as we learned in the last lecture, every action online has some consequence for our actual lives. And that's because the internet has become so integrated into our society, just as electricity became integrated in our society during the turn of the century. Everything has an online component, and that's becoming, well, that's very true now, but it's becoming more and more true as we advance, as we talked about last week with the Internet of Things, and how pretty soon we will have technology that less and less supports our lives and more supplements it. So let's not start getting into those too much yet, because we are going to talk about the difference between those things in a moment. But first, let's talk about technology and what it does and why it exists. So there's an old adage that says that necessity is the mother of invention, and that is true, and it is the crux of this issue, right? No technology, nothing since the Big Bang, I should say, nothing in our entire universe since the Big Bang is spawned randomly from primordial chaos. We live in a universe that is deterministic, that is fatalistic, that has causality. And there is an impetus for all actions, and all inventions come from a need to invent. So yes, necessity is the mother of invention. All technology exists to solve a problem, and that problem has to do in one fashion or another with human work. Human work is essentially the transaction of a human being converting our potential energy into something of practical use, whether that is plowing a field, writing a novel, driving a car, making a phone call. All of these are human work. They require a human being to perform some action for some end. Now, the way that technology supports that work comes in many different stripes. And there is the definitions that we are going to be reaching for. But the terms are supporting, supplementing, or enhancing human work. All technology will, in one or more of those ways, be invented to do one of those things to augment human work. Or in short, to borrow a phrase from Descartes, Je pense, je suis, cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. But in the case of technology, we think, therefore it is. We invent technology to mitigate some problem with human work so that we can focus on the creative and the cognitive, so that we can do more inventing, so we can produce more ideas, so that we can advance. Now, proof of this is all over our history. Prior to the Neolithic Revolution, 100% of human time was spent surviving, hunting and gathering. Any off time we had was scarce and scant, and we used it to invent things that would make the process of hunting and gathering easier. We would weave baskets. We would use flint knapping to create arrowheads and spearheads. We would try to invent things so that we would spend less time hunting and gathering in order to survive. The Neolithic Revolution is just that. The Neolithic Revolution was only possible because of two major inventions. They say that there are two things that were absolutely necessary for us to go from hunter-gatherer subsistence survivalists to an agrarian agricultural society. Those inventions are bread and beer. Our ability to take grain that we had cultivated and convert it into a form that could be preserved and be consumed as calories later was essential to our conversion from subsistence hunter-gatherers to an agricultural society. And with that revolution in agriculture came even more free time, which allowed us to focus on the creative and cognitive and move on to other inventions like the written word, the printing press, the telephone, the internet. Let's move on. So we're talking about essentially a straight line from the earliest developments of technology all the way up to our current technology that we enjoy, and any technology that comes after this will rest upon the necessity of those previous technologies. There is a term that says that geniuses stand on the shoulders of giants, and what that means is that anything that is created now relies upon all of the thought and the inventions that came before it. We have political philosophy in the United States because of previous thinkers like Immanuel Kant, like Knox, like Smith, like many, many others, and of course our founding fathers, Jefferson, Washington, Adams, Hamilton, so on and so forth. But even they relied upon the prior political thought that came before it, and if we go back far enough in history, all of that relies upon the theories of democracy from ancient Greece, the theories of the self, and if we go even farther back than that, we'll find even more. It's not a question of if it exists, it's just a question of whether or not we can find any evidence of it existing. Of course it is out there. So someday we will invent teleportation, but that process of teleportation, even though the wheel has nothing to do, or likely will not have anything to do with the process of teleportation, we could not have invented, or sorry, I'm going to keep saying it as if it's been invented. We cannot invent the concept of the technology of teleportation without first being able to, without first inventing the wheel, because without inventing the wheel, we would never be able to move anything heavy. We'd never be able to construct buildings. We'd never be able to, therefore, construct libraries. Never be able to construct, things, gather materials for printing presses, and so on and so forth. So you see what I mean. Everything rests upon one thing or another. And this straight line from the Neolithic Revolution all the way to our modern era comes from, it can be summed up rather in a quote from one of our founding fathers, John Adams. And I'm going to paraphrase this, so it may be completely wrong, but this is my recollection of it. John Adams said during the American Revolution that they study war so that their sons can study farming, and their sons will study farming so that their sons, the grandsons of the founding fathers, can study art and philosophy. So essentially, they needed to fight a war to found a country so that there could be enough peace and land and prosperity to grow crops. And those crops would be necessary in order for America to have a culture. And culture is essential to their future. All right, so let's define these three terms: supports, supplements, and enhances. So what does it mean when we say that technology supports our lives? Well, what we mean by that is that technology fulfills a role of improving the efficiency of human work. So it allows us to do things that we can already do just faster, better, in greater volume, something like that. So there's going to be a car analogy. I'm sorry, I got a hair over here. There's going to be a car analogy here that will help to illustrate this point. So let's consider the process of designing a car. Now, prior to the invention of the personal computer, if you needed to design a car, it would require many, many artists making different concept drawings, sculpting 3D models out of clay, building different scale prototypes in order to do things like efficiency testing, or putting it in a wind tunnel to see if the kind of drag that the design had. But after that, we have technology, and now we no longer need as many people doing that work. We can make many drawings in computers. We can make models in virtual space and rotate them in real time in 3D. We can run any kind of physics models we want on it to at least have some kind of a determination of its efficiency before a prototype is even developed. When we say that technology supplements our lives, well, that's where we're going. Supports is about where we are at now for the most part. Of course, technology fills all of these roles in many different ways in our society. What I mean when I say that we're at a point where technology supports our lives, I mean in general, predominantly, if we think of a type of technology, it probably is at a point where it supports our lives. But it's very rare for technology in our age to actually take us completely out of the equation. That's what supplements means. It means that humans, we've invented a technology and we no longer need humans to do that work at all. So in the process of a car, again, let's say it's been designed and now we're building a car. Now, in the old days, in order to build a car, you needed to have a human being with knowledge of how to build a car, or at least how to do their piece of the pie. Of course, that was Henry Ford's Great Revolution. He didn't invent the car had already been invented. What he invented was a more efficient way of assembling them with interchangeable parts, meaning that he didn't have to have human beings who knew how to build a car. They only needed to have human beings who knew how to build a piece of a car, or to assemble a piece of a car. And that was an improvement in efficiency, and that was a technological revolution. So technology comes in many forms, not just necessarily something tangible that can be held in your hands, or a doodad that does something. But then we invented technology beyond the assembly line, like robots. Robots, literally the word robot comes from the root word meaning to work. That's what a robot is. We invent robots in order to do some kind of work for us. And we now have robots that can be programmed to assemble cars just as human beings used to do. So now we don't need as many or any human beings to actually assemble the car themselves, but we do need human beings to assemble and maintain and program the robots. That means we need fewer humans for those roles, but we do still need humans to do that. But that leaves us with kind of a problem, because it means that there are also fewer humans that know how to build a car, right? We become divorced from the process. We only need to know how to run the robot, not how to do the robot's work. When I say that we're on the cusp of technology changing from a predominantly supporting role to a predominantly supplementing role, what I mean is that we're at a point where technology is beginning to take more and more of the work that we are doing every day onto itself. Things like, we already have crash avoidance, we already have parallel parking that is automatic, but soon we're going to have autopilot, right? The great dream of the technology of the automobile, that someday the human work of turning the steering wheel and navigating to a location will be taken out of our hands, or at least largely out of our hands. Now, when I say that technology enhances our lives, what I'm talking about is technology allowing humans to do work that would otherwise be impossible, allowing us to do things that we could not otherwise do. I'm going to go back to the car analogy on this one, but a perfect example of that is the space shuttle, or even the space suit. We could not survive in the vacuum of space without this technology. The technology allows us to do something we cannot possibly do otherwise. Now, in a car, some good examples of the technologies that enhance our lives there are things like backup cameras and GPS systems. Now, of course, we can back up a car without a camera. We've been doing it for hundreds of years. What we can't do is see into a blind spot without the benefit of a camera. We can't see what we're backing up into within 3 or 4 feet, depending on the model of car that you have, or well, I guess it could be even farther than that in a lot of cases. We simply cannot see there. Our eyes won't allow us to see through that space. And of course, we can navigate long distances without the benefit of map or compass. Map and compass, of course, are both also technological advancements. We can navigate without GPS, and we can navigate without map or compass by navigating by star. What we can't do is navigate long distances in unfamiliar territory without the stars. And even, I would argue, navigating by star is a technological revolution. It's not one, again, that's tangible that you can hold in your hand like a compass or a sextant or a GPS unit or a satellite, but it did have to be puzzled out. There was some manner of cognitive process to bring the process of navigation by star into being. So I would argue that is a technological advancement in and of itself. And if we take that away, then human beings can't navigate. We don't have any, like homing pigeons or really any birds and many creatures. We don't really have an innate sense of direction, right? So as we move into this transition to the point at which technology supplements our lives rather than supports it, what this looks like is a technological revolution. In example that I gave you before of autopilot. What it also means that soon you won't have to worry about making sure that you get your oil changed on time because your car will manage that for you. You won't have to make grocery lists because your refrigerator will be able to take inventory. What you see here is a smart egg container that sends you a message and adds eggs to your grocery list when you're below a certain threshold of eggs. That's supplementing technology. And we rely on technology to support our lives in ways that we cannot really live without anymore. But with supplementing, again, as we saw, as I explained with the process of robots, we become divorced from the actual process that the technology is supplementing. And we rely on it for work, just as we rely on technology for a lot of processes now. In short, we use technology to solve problems. Sometimes problems we didn't even know we had. Sometimes problems we didn't have before technology. Even problems created by technology. Green technology is a perfect example of that. We are facing an unprecedented climate crisis at the moment because technology allowed us to pollute the world on a scale that would be otherwise impossible for any other natural creature. Fossil fuels, right? But what's the answer? To do away with that technology? To simply do without it? Well, that's unthinkable, right? It's unthinkable in our society. It would have major ramifications. And certainly cause a lot of discomfort. And there are two primary motivating factors in human behavior: the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of discomfort. Well, what we do with fossil fuels brings us pleasure, and doing without it would be uncomfortable. So what is the answer? The answer is, of course, technology. Technology got us into this mess. We need technology to get us out. So solar, wind, hydroelectric, these are technological advancements that we hope will help us solve the problem. And that's on top of technologies that are designed to, for example, clean up after oil spills, or remove carbon from the atmosphere, or to capture CFCs before they have a chance to punch a hole in the ozone layer, or even to replace the ozone layer. All technologies that are meant to solve problems that we didn't have before technology. The question is, what problem of human work does the internet solve? If everything exists because necessity is the mother of invention, then there was a problem that the internet needed to solve. Well, rather than directly answering the question, I will just show you this image here, and I bet you all know what this means. I don't have to explain it to you. You just see the image and you know what this means. If I show you this, I don't need to explain this. You know what it means. Even if I cut out everything else and I just have the mouse's face, you can relate to it and you know what it's referring to. Same with this image, right? One of the earliest internet memes, possibly the first internet meme, the dancing baby. I don't need to explain this. It's not very deep. It's just a dancing baby and it's cute and funny. I don't need to explain it. You know what it means. These are pre-internet memes. This S shape is not a gang symbol. It's not a corporate logo. It just is. The S symbol is drawn all over the place, and it has been for a very long time, since possibly the 70s, 80s, definitely in the 90s, because I saw it all over the place in the 90s. It just is an idea, a shape that caught on and disseminated throughout the world. Same with the obey symbol that you see here, Andre the Giant's face with obey. An artist created that, and it became ubiquitous. Right? It was stenciled on walls all over the place, not by the artist, but by people who just picked it up. That's a meme. Here we have even older memes. Frodo Lives from the 70s and 60s. Kilroy, right? The face that you see there peeking over the wall. Kilroy was here. Just a little doodle that was drawn all over the place in the 30s and 40s. Before that and after that, of course. Particularly popular with service members in World War II. Spread the idea all over the world. You see it all over the place. Kilroy was here. What about the word okay? We spell okay, O-K-A-Y. And we use it all the time. As a matter of fact, okay is the most used word on our planet. It is directly translatable in every language. There are people who speak solely French, solely Spanish, solely Afrikaans, solely Russian. They all know what okay means. They all use the word okay. The original spelling of okay is not O-K-A-Y. That's an anachronism. We spell it that way because we think that that must be correct. We don't exactly know what it means, except, we know it means okay. We don't exactly know where it comes from, but we don't exactly know where most of our words come from. Well, the word okay is a meme. It's actually the convergence of two memes. There were two fads around the turn of the century that were popular. One of them was intentionally misspelling words, the height of hilarity for the time. The other was abbreviating things. The word okay is in fact the letter O and the letter K because of the meme at the time of abbreviating things. And the words that it's abbreviating, all, O-L-L, intentionally misspelled, and correct with a K, intentionally misspelled. Okay, all correct. And we use that even still today. And that's not even the beginning. What you see here, Seda Repotenet Opera and Rotas, is a meme from Roman times. That graffiti is scrawled all over the place. Those words actually do mean something in Latin, but it's essentially nonsense. It's just that they happen to make the same words when spelled in multiple directions. And of course, Roman graffiti is rife with phallic symbols, and so our cave painting is going back to the earliest days of humanity, as you see here. The first meme was a dick joke. So the answer to the question, what problem of human work does the internet solve? The answer is quite simply communication. The problem of communication. And that is not a new problem for us. As a matter of fact, some of our greatest inventions throughout our collective history have been invented to help us communicate better. Proof positive. I'm speaking to you now, and presumably you understand what I'm saying. There is no other creature in the entire animal kingdom that uses language in a way that we do, in a way that is as complex, that is as diverse, that is as expressive. Now, why do we use speech, and why are so many of our most important inventions centered around communication? Human speech helps us communicate with each other better. The written word helps us communicate with each other throughout time and distance. The telephone helps us communicate the telegraph, the printing press, the internet. They all help us to communicate more efficiently. They enhance our ability to communicate by giving us the ability to communicate over vast distances, over time, to record our words so that they can be replayed. To answer that question, I will paraphrase a quote from Ben Franklin. What good is a newborn baby? So logically, in a survival of the fittest sense, any creature, which is to survive, must develop its primary survival mechanism as soon as possible. Any creature that doesn't do that, now not that the process of natural selection is logical or anything like that, because of course the phrase that nature doesn't make any mistakes isn't exactly true, I suppose. But logically it follows, right? So for example, a horse, their primary survival mechanism is their ability to outrun other things on the grassy plains. And a foal can run mere hours after birth. A couple of hours, a foal will be up and running around. Certainly not as fast as the older horses, but it can run. Other creatures are soon able to fly after birth. Some creatures are born with spines. Some creatures are born poisonous. But a human being doesn't have a shell. We don't have spines. We don't have claws. We don't have teeth. We can't run after we're born. We can't do anything for many years after we're born. We are helpless as babies, and we need to be protected for many years before we can even possibly survive on our own. So, what good is a newborn baby? What can a baby do? I will spare you the jokes about how babies just poop and eat and sleep, because what we do, the first thing we do right after we're born, is cry. We cry. That's what we can do right away, and that's what we do for the first couple of years of our lives. The expectation that we can communicate with other human beings and receive help to get us what we need and to foster our growth and development until we are able to take care of ourselves and then take care of the next generation of humans is our primary survival mechanism. And that is why all of our most significant achievements have been to improve, enhance, support, or supplement the human work of communication. Now, if you look here at this chart, this timeline from Steve Anderson, you'll see some of our achievements here, our achievements in communication. The telephone. This chart measures the amount of time it took people to adopt new technologies, and they define this as having 25% of market access, meaning that 25% of people within the market have the ability or have access to this technology. Now, it took 50 years for a quarter of the population to have access to the telephone, 38 years for radio, 22 years for television, 14 years for the PC, 7 years for the internet, 2.75 years for the iPhone, and just 19 days for Pokemon Go. And these are all improvements in the human work of communication, even Pokemon Go. The only thing that changes is how quickly we adopt it. This is proof positive of how one advancement improves upon the next. The human work in communication may seem to us to be trivial, but it's not. Consider the Battle of Marathon. Everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with what a marathon is. It's a race, an endurance race where you run 26.2 miles. It's called a marathon because of the Battle of Marathon, in which Athens and Persia were fighting about 26.2 miles away from the city of Athens. There was a man, and at the time, the transaction cost for communication was fairly significant. If you wanted somebody to know something, you had to give them a message. You could write it down, but you had to give somebody a message, and it had to be delivered in person. The 26.2 miles that this messenger named Phidippides ran wasn't his first. As a matter of fact, before the Battle of Marathon first began, the Athenians sent Phidippides to Sparta to call upon their aid. So he had to run over 150 miles through Greece over the course of 3 days to reach Sparta and ask their help. The Spartans refused because they were very superstitious, and the oracle told them that they should not go until their celebrations were over. Then he had to run 150 miles over 3 days back to Marathon to deliver the bad news. By then, the battle was already on. But then the Athenians needed Phidippides to send a message to Athens to let them know that they had won the battle, because the Athenian Senate was about to make a decision rather rashly, with the expectation that the armies would lose the Battle of Marathon. And so he then ran immediately afterwards the 26 miles to Athens, where, the story goes, he immediately died of exhaustion thereafter. That's a pretty high transaction cost for communication. The transaction cost for writing something down is much less. The transaction cost, and by transaction cost we're talking about an evaluation within our minds of the amount of effort of human work in order to achieve the desired outcome. Less and less as we go through. And it seems trivial in our era because it is trivial in our era. We have technology that allows us to communicate to every person on the planet in practically an instant, from anywhere we are to anywhere they are, which is an astounding miracle, one that we take for granted just as we took electricity for granted so long ago, just as we take the internet for granted now. We use this technology in so many different ways in our society. We engage with our political process via modern mass telecommunications. We have political discourse over mass political communications, and we engage with our politicians via modern mass telecommunications. We engage with our culture via these means. Our information seeking and socializing takes place online. None of this is exclusively online, but in a way that integrates seamlessly with existing institutions. So we engage with these platforms and traditional platforms simultaneously. Our economy, we engage with markets via modern mass telecommunications. We communicate with other consumers via these same institutions. Almost every aspect of our society, in one way or another, engages with these communication methods. So how does all of this met out for us individually? Well, the lower transaction cost, for one. So consider, I am pre-Neolithic Revolution human, and I need water to survive. I need to decide, do I go all the way to the watering hole with all of the dangers that presents? Not only do I need to expend a tremendous amount of energy, and I need to spend water in that case to get water, but there's also predators or perhaps other unfriendly humans that I may have to make a sacrifice I'm not willing to make in that case. Meanwhile, I could use a shovel that I've invented to dig a well. That's a tremendous amount of work, and I don't know for sure if that will work out for me. Maybe there's no water down there. Maybe I can't dig deep enough to get to the water. That's a transaction cost evaluation. I need to decide which is the greatest reward for the least effort. Modern telecommunication provides us the absolute lowest rock-bottom transaction cost for communication in the history of the human race. Date displacement. The written word allowed us to communicate with other human beings through time. Before that, as Socrates said, his words would disappear into the ether, and only those who heard it and thought his words important enough to remember would live on. Not so when we write things down. The most significant revolution, specifically of the internet, is the facilitation of publishing authority, or the decentralization of publishing authority. Prior to the invention of the internet, if you had something that you wanted to say to a lot of people, you had to convince the right people that what you had to say was worth hearing. You had to go to newspaper editors. You had to go to movie producers, music producers. You had to show them your work and you had to convince them that they should publish your communication. That stopped almost immediately with the advent of the internet, and that's why so many of those institutions suffered a great deal after the internet became popularized. That's why there was so much, why print media started to close, why movies and music had to adapt to new markets. Because no longer did you have to convince the right people. You just go out on the internet and you can, any thought you have that enters into your head, you can find a platform or create a platform. And you can put it out there for the entire world to see. This is great, right? This is a great advancement for humanity. But of course, every advancement in the efficiency, everything that improves the efficiency of a system will also improve the efficiency of flaws in that system. And now we're at a point where without a centralized publishing authority, where everyone can publish any content they want, we have a glut of content. The contrast is between George Orwell's 1984, which envisioned a dystopian future society where humans, or where people, could not get the information they needed because the government was censoring it. Contrast that with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where there was too much information, where it's a dystopian future where people cannot determine what is important from what is unimportant. They cannot separate the signal from the noise because there's so much choice. There's so much out there that they can't decide. That's about where we are. There's so much content, we can't possibly absorb it all. We can't possibly get our news from every source that publishes it. We can't possibly read every blog post. We can't possibly watch every video. We have to self-select. And the process of self-selection leads to what's known as echo chambers. That's one of the flaws in the system of communication. It was always there, but now there's so much content, we can't avoid it. So what that means is, again, the two primary motivating factors of human behavior is the pursuit of comfort and the avoidance of discomfort. And ideas that challenge our morals or challenge our preconceived notions or challenge our existing knowledge is uncomfortable. So we avoid those sources of knowledge and we seek out those that agree with us. That's an echo chamber, where we surround ourselves only with content that agrees with our point of view and only communicate with people that agree with our point of view, and so on. It's just an example of one of the flaws in this system. But they're not new. Let's consider the flaw in information seeking and news dissemination. These days we say fake news or clickbait, and we think that this is something that's new to the modern internet, but it's not. It's not. Clickbait is just yellow journalism. Now, consider these are functions of the system of communication, because the system of communication has proclivities of its own. And in America, the proclivity of the idiosyncrasy of news dissemination is that we live in a capitalist society, and so the business of news dissemination and information seeking is capitalized as well, meaning that there's a profit incentive in the news. At the Industrial Revolution at the turn of the century, the agrarian societies in the United States were urbanizing, right? We were moving to concentrated urban centers, people living in cities. And so the economics of news dissemination dictated that the best way to sell newspapers was to have a paper boy on the street corner shouting headlines, right? Like, hear, you read all about it. The better the headline, or the more sensational the headline, the more people were drawn in and the more papers were sold. So there's an economic incentive to have sensationalized headlines. It's called yellow journalism. Today we call it clickbait, right? Because there's an economic incentive to have as many people click on your link for news as possible. It doesn't matter if they stay and read it. It doesn't matter if it's true. It just matters that they click on it. More clicks, more money. Now think about fake news as well. Well, we can go back in history again. The economics of news changed. After World War II, people began moving away from urban centers, out to the suburbs. People are too far away. There's no busy street corners out in the suburbs, so the idea of having a paper boy on the corner shouting headlines is worthless. You're not going to make any money that way. This is why the news began to move to subscription models. You'd get a subscription to the paper, and a paperboy would deliver it to your door every day. Well, this changes things, right? As a matter of fact, in this model, sensationalized headlines are not the incentive. In fact, you want to avoid them, because if you publish anything that your subscribers would find to be distasteful or that they would disagree with, well, they might cancel their subscription, and then we would lose money. So we have an incentive to not publish certain stories, to not cover certain stories. But we also have a financial incentive to publish salacious stories. This is the era of the term, if it bleeds, it leads, comes from, because people have a morbid curiosity with that kind of thing. We don't want to publish anything prurient because they might cancel their subscription, but we want to give them the things that they secretly find tantalizing, that they secretly want to know about. So violence is just fine. This also means that if we are the only ones to publish a story, more people will subscribe or buy our paper. So we need to be first. This is called the era of the scoop, where news dissemination, news agencies would fall all over each other to get exclusive stories. Those weren't always entirely accurate. Fake news, that's what we call it now. The only reason that we have both is because we have improved the efficiency of the dissemination of news to the point where we can support both, where there's an economic incentive at times to have both a sensationalized headline and a fake article. There are other problems involved with improving the efficiency of the communication system. For example, infrastructure disruptions, right? Here we see the tragic consequences of a breakdown in infrastructure due to a cyber attack. We cannot communicate our need to order more chicken wings and cheesy crust. We cannot communicate to our warehouse to send them if there are disruptions in the service. There's the problem with the divorce from process, just as robots divorce us from the process of building cars, and so fewer people know how to build cars. There's also an additional problem in our world today where human life depends upon technology. All of our critical infrastructure is based upon the same technology. This also leads to other problems because access to technology is not universal. I mean, you here in America, you may believe that everybody has access to the internet, but it's simply not true. If we look at the world, of course, we might as Americans say, of course, Africans don't have access to the internet. They're impoverished. There's large areas where they barely have electricity and running water. Of course, that's a Eurocentric or ethnocentric point of view, but sure, okay. But there are plenty of places here in the United States that do not have internet access. As a matter of fact, if you go about a mile or 3 away from any decently sized town, and your options for getting the internet are severely limited. In Stevens Point, we have broadband. Soon we'll have fiber. Our TDS is moving in, rather. But I used to live in Blenker, which is between Point and Marshfield. It's only about 10 miles away, if that. Could not get internet access out there, right? The best I could do after a while is when DSL service moved into the area, and I was able to get DSL. I don't know if you even know what DSL is, but it's a very slow internet connection. What that means is that without the ability to engage with modern telecommunication systems, without the ability to engage in the internet, then we can't engage in all of those systems that I showed on the previous slide. We can't engage with our political structures. We cannot engage with markets. We cannot engage with the court of public opinion. We cannot develop our online identity. We can't take part in those processes. And there's a lot more at stake there, because then we're essentially isolated from society. So there are 4 elements that distinguish online interactions from offline interactions, and I did talk about these in the last slide, so I shouldn't have included this one as well. So we'll move on. So essentially, what anonymity means, as the saying goes, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. It's a place where we shouldn't have an identity, where all ideas should be able to stand on their own merit rather than being considered by those who delivered them. The very reason why the Federalist Papers were published anonymously. The idea should stand on its own. But that's not what happened, right? If you look at the internet now, identity, offline identity, things like ethnicity, race, gender, level of education, socioeconomic status, They are a part of our online interactions all the time, and they don't need to be, because on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. You can pretend to be anybody you want. Nobody's going to know the difference, but we bring that baggage with us. Now, why? Let's talk about persona ex machina. Persona ex machina. Ex machina is a Latin term, from the machine. You might be familiar with the term deus ex machina, God from the machine, which is a term in storytelling where there is a sudden cavalry coming over the hill at the last minute, saves the day kind of a thing. Like, it just kind of comes out of nowhere. Well, persona ex machina is persona, the Latin word for mask. Mask from the machine, or person from the machine. Your persona, you have many personas, right? You might consider yourself outgoing, shy, introverted, extroverted. You may be patient, impatient. You may be loud. You may be quiet. You may be fast. You may be slow. You may be funny. You may be dour. All of these things make up your personality, your persona. But you have more than one persona. You have several, right? You have what are known as behavioral schema. Behavioral schema are coping mechanisms, personas we develop to help us to cope with unfamiliar situations. And you have many personas. You are not the same person with your parents as you are with your friends or at work. And you have a persona for all kinds of different situations. You have a consumer persona, how you engage with markets. You have a child persona. You might have a parent persona. You have an employee persona. And it can become uncomfortable when these worlds collide, right? If your friends and your parents meet, you begin to feel uncomfortable because you're not sure which persona to adopt, which one makes sense, because you're conflicted, right? So you have multiple schemas, multiple behavioral schemas. They help you. If you have a student schema that you developed in high school or throughout your, developed beginning in kindergarten all the way through high school, and then you go to college. It's an unfamiliar situation. You're in a new place. Your parents aren't around to help you anymore. You had to leave your friends behind. You're in college now. That is a very difficult situation. And the way you cope is by relying on prior behavioral schemas, right? You fall back on your student schema in order to cope. When we find ourselves in situations without an applicable behavioral schema, we're very uncomfortable. We don't know what to do. And we feel better. Like, let's say, for example, we have a friend schema, and we meet a new person, and we're not sure if they're a friend or not, and it's really awkward, right? We're trying to find conversation, we're trying to get along, and then it clicks. When it clicks, that's us being able to apply that schema. We're now comfortable, right? We're in a situation where it's like, okay, this is enough like this other situation where I know how to act now, right? We don't need to bring those behavioral schemas online. There's no reason why we need to bring our American citizen schema to the internet. There's no reason why we would need to bring our employee schema to the internet. But we do, because that's how we cope with these situations. We rely on them. Our traditional personas are defined by what we are. In real life, we cannot, I mean, not that we can't, but in our traditional persona, what we are partly defines who we are. We can't change things like how our gender is perceived, unless, of course, we go through great lengths to do so. That's part of what makes being trans so painful, is that they feel as if they are one way, but they are perceived as being another, and there's a disconnect there. Their traditional persona does not match the way that they feel inside. It's uncomfortable. Our ethnicity, our race, for better or worse, is part of our traditional persona, because we cannot change that, and we can't change how we're perceived by that. I mean, we can change how we're perceived through social change, but what I mean is we can't prevent somebody from identifying us. If we have black skin, we cannot prevent somebody from identifying us as being black. If we appear to be a man, we cannot prevent people from perceiving us as a man. We can't control how they react to that. Now, our traditional personas have nothing to do with our digital persona, but we bring those online because they help us to cope with those new situations. It's uncomfortable to not have a behavioral schema to apply. Our behavioral persona is defined not by what we are, but what we do. And our digital persona is a behavioral persona. It's partly informed by our traditional persona. Now we talk about social norms. So what happens when people get together, when human beings get together? and they engage in a shared activity, whether that shared activity is hunting for the tribe, or building a house, serving on a ship, working on an assembly line, going to comic conventions. The answer is bonding. We do that naturally. We are social creatures. It's part of why communication is our primary survival mechanism, and even the most introverted among us must, they don't necessarily admit, but truthfully cannot live without the presence of other people in their lives, even if they have very little contact with them. Now, when people bond over an experience, a subculture naturally develops. So, a subculture, just very quickly, we have an American culture, and American culture is overarching over everything else. All Americans share an American culture, and because we have a shared experience of being an American. An American culture is defined by certain traits, like, for example, capitalism and representative democracy and rugged individualism and entrepreneurship, all of those things that being an American is being an American. But we're all not just Americans, right? Americans are all different kinds, and there's different subcultures that developed based upon subcategories of that culture. So we know what it's like to be, for example, plumbers. There's a fraternity of plumbers. I am an information security professional, and there's a subculture for information security. We have our own kind of language. We have our own conferences. We share a lot of the same experiences, so we bond over those. Furthermore, we have a subculture for what it's like to be an information security professional in America. Now, I share information security subculture with all other practitioners, regardless of their position in American culture. But Americans, those who share both of those, there's an additional bonding experience. There's subcultures that will develop over everything, right? Truckers have a professional subculture. There's a professional subculture over sports. Packer fans are a thing. Some people are so into their subculture with sports that they visit physical violence upon people who support the wrong team. There's a subculture for hobbyists, right? Cosplayers have a subculture. There's a subculture for ethnicities, right? Those all exist within the fabric of the overarching culture because they fit in with the overarching culture. They don't violate any social norms or legal norms. But then there are other types of subcultures that we call deviant subcultures. Right? Gambling is legal in certain contexts. It's illegal in others. But even legal gambling can be considered deviant, or is considered deviant, right? Just because it's legal to go to Vegas and bet your kid's college tuition on a single spin of the roulette wheel doesn't mean that it's not considered deviant. That would be considered very deviant behavior. Sex work can be done in a legal context, right? Porn stars legally work in the sex industry. Of course, it can be done illegally as well. It's still considered deviant either way. It's just not necessarily illegal. Alcoholics, right, for example, are a deviant subculture. If you're old enough to drink, alcohol is legal to consume, but there is a socially acceptable way to consume it. And if you are an alcoholic, then by very definition, you are deviating from those social norms and part of a deviant subculture. And if you don't believe alcoholics have a subculture, well, I mean, AA and lots of other institutions for alcoholics. If you go to a bar and you see the regulars there, they're most certainly alcoholics, and they certainly bond over their experiences of being alcoholics. Then we have illegal deviant subcultures, like, for example, pedophiles, right? They are outside of American culture. The existence of the subculture is itself anathema to the overarching culture. But subcultures do develop, and people do bond over their experience of being pedophiles, right? There are dark corners of the internet where pedophiles will congregate to support each other, to share contraband materials, to encourage each other in this behavior. They're there. And that is it for this week, it seems. Yep. Okay. Thank you very much for joining me. We will see you next time, where we're going to begin talking about some of the practical aspects of evidence retrieval and identification, getting into some digital forensic work. Thank you. We'll see you next time.